Hi,
Hello,
Rachel.
it's really good to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you here. So, before we get started, I know we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself, beyond the intro kind of thing, and your current role at Google?
Yeah, sure. So, you mentioned I'm content lead for Chrome Developer Relations, and day to day, that means that I manage a small team of really excellent writers, and we publish to web.dev and developer.chrome.com. So, if you've read anything on one of those sites, that has been something that my team have worked on. We're basically supporting DevRel and the broader Chrome organization to, with all the content about features and things. So yes, that's kind of the main part of my work. As you mentioned, I'm also involved in Baseline, which we'll talk about. And I've been a CSS Working Group member for a very long time. I joined as an invited expert originally, and now obviously I'm at Google, so I represent Google on the working group, and I edit a couple of specs, multi-column layout, and is the sort of main one that I do work on. And there's other things that I kind of chip in with, as needed, particularly layout things and things to do with print as well. CSS for print, I'm interested in.
Amazing. So, one of the things that we didn't mention in the intro, but I know you were interested in talking about it, and it was announced just last week, the focus areas of Interop 2025. Um, Can you share a little bit about what Interop is and which browsers are involved in it and so on?
Yeah, sure. So, Interop is a project that's been running since 2022, although there was a sort of predecessor in 2021. And what this is it's a project that brings together browser vendors and other implementers. So that's people from Chrome, Safari, and Firefox, and Edge, but also people from Igalia and Bocoup who do implementations and tests and things. So we all get together and we identify a list of focus areas. And these are things that are typically pain points for developers. So places where there are interoperability problems. It might be that it's completely missing in a browser, or it could be that it is actually in the browsers, but there's a bunch of bugs and issues that people trip over. So we get those things together, and then every year, all of the browsers work to try and get those things fixed, and get to the end of the year, and we can go, great, the platform has got better and more stable. So there's a dashboard at wpt.fyi interop dash 2025 is this year's. And so, yeah, you can go there and you can kind of follow along. It's based on web platform tests. So as tests pass, the score gets higher, and hopefully we all, get to the end and we've got a more or less complete score for each thing.
Nice. So I saw they were talking a lot about like the focus areas of 2024 and what was accomplished. I mean, do you want to can you share some of what you feel like were kind of the key accomplishments last year?
Yeah, and I guess it depends what you're most interested in. I mean,
Right.
the nice thing with last year is that every um, browser got to 99 out of 100. So pretty much all of the tests were passing for all of the features. Um, Things I think are particularly interesting, like app property. So a way to, create custom properties in CSS that have got default values and types. It makes those very simple CSS variables so much more powerful. And makes them easier to use as well. You're not going to end up with someone trying to set something that should have a number in as a color or what have you. Little things like text wrap balance, I thought is a nice feature because it's something that I think anyone who's come from a sort of a print background or a traditional design background, the web is quite frustrating because you have all these sort of things where lines are unbalanced and things look messy because you think, well, we should be able to balance those headings, and it seems like it's taken a long time to have had a feature that just does that. And so having little features like that become interoperable, they're small things, but it's really nice to see. And then there's sort of methods for APIs and so on. Request video frame callback was included for video, so that lets you schedule a function that runs with the next video frame. So there's kind of all kinds of things, from big features to small. Popover was included, CSS nesting, declarative shadow DOM, a whole bunch of stuff.
Nice. Yeah, it seems like a lot of things are like those paper cut type issues that
Mm.
would be help you smooth the whole experience because you don't have to deal with like kind of Oh, I lost my word. See, 5 years apparently does not make you an expert.
Well,
But yeah,
yeah, and
so
I think,
yeah,
yeah, you sort of look at the list of tests and you think, oh, some of those look really like who's running into that? What's that? But everything is something that someone is going to trip up over because people do all
yeah,
sorts of things, and the combinations of different features often, cause problems. And so, I
yeah.
kind of think that, each test passing is something that someone's not running into.
Nice. And I just want to remind the audience, you can put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A module. So like, please ask questions. But I do have some other questions. So sticking on this interop topic. So we talked about last year. Like, what are the focus areas for this year? And are there any like you're particularly interested in yourself?
Yeah, so I think there's some stuff that's pretty new to the platform. So, for instance, view transitions. And what's included for this year is for single page apps. So transitions in single page apps are going to be included. Another thing that's included is anchor positioning. Again, a fairly new thing. Is going to make popovers so much more useful because you're going to be able to position them. That's such a useful thing, and I think that's one of the things that helps people remove an awful lot of, custom JavaScript or third-party libraries that having to use to get that kind of thing in their app. So to have that as part of the platform is cool. Core Web Vitals, there's an inclusion of that. So getting those performance APIs working everywhere, navigation APIs included. So yeah, again, there's just stuff all over the platform. And then there are areas sort of there's an area called Compact, which just bundles up a sort of a bunch of little things that people fall over. So yeah, I think it's looking like a really good year, and that's a whole bunch of cool stuff. If that all happens, that's going to be part of the platform.
Amazing. And so do you, having been a part of this effort, do you find like there's a difficulty in kind of getting all the browsers to agree, or seems like if everybody got to 99 out of you know percent last year, like pretty much everybody's on board with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the difficulties are really what you'd imagine if you're trying to get a bunch of companies, big companies together to all agree on a set of things to work on because, browsers are just businesses. And as we all know, businesses have got different priorities. They've got, it's very small teams actually work on implementation of platform features. So you've got constraints and the code base of browsers is different, so what might be easy for Chrome to implement might not be easy for Firefox to implement or vice versa. So that's really the thing. It's a bunch of meetings to go through and make sure that the things that are chosen are implementable by everybody. And also that, obviously people are having to have internal meetings and decide whether there is time and space and the people to do each of the things. So I think, it's a case of a bunch of businesses working together and saying, well, which of these things can we all work together on? Because we could pick anything, but if people aren't able to do it for whatever reason, that's not helpful. So yeah, it's a lot of alignment. I think sometimes people think there's more tension than really there is. That there are things on the web platform that certain browsers disagree with, and those things tend to be quite publicly, noted. We have standards positions against things or whatever. But generally, things that have gone through the standards process, that are on the standards track, it really is just a case of, when people have got time to be working on them. And so that's really the sort of discussions is what's the set of things that we can all work together on and we can actually land before the end of the year.
That sounds great. I mean, yeah, I guess the difficult part is dealt with before it even gets to to this point, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, we want to be able to. Obviously, you never know, and because as I say that there are individuals who are very much the expert on a certain part of the platform, or and you never know if people are out. It's small teams, so it doesn't always work that everything gets done. I think last year was particularly successful, but that's the aim. And in previous years, sometimes things have landed a little bit after the end of the year, but they've still happened. So, so yeah, it's just a really nice momentum, and it's nice to have this idea that yes, these things are going to happen this year.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so we do have some actual audience questions that I want to make sure I get to.
Mhm.
So Alexander asks, what is your take on JSO, or maybe it's JS0 and JS Sugar? I don't know if you're aware of those. I actually am not. So
I'm not really. I'm afraid I'm not. I know I'm speaking at a JavaScript conference. Um, I'm very much a CSS person. In fact, I mean, as a developer, I was really a back-end developer. I can admit to having been a PHP developer for a very, very long time. That's what I kind of think of as my main language. Though I'm fairly out of date these days, so PHP isn't particularly useful at Google, as you can imagine. Um, but but yes, no, I'm sorry, I don't have opinions on those because I don't I sort of vaguely know the names, but that's about it.
I don't even know the name, so I'm clearly out of the loop. This is what happens when you leave Twitter permanently. You just lose track of things. Um, so Anthony asks, how often do you guys meet up to see how progress is going on tackling issues for each browser?
Yeah, there are regular meetings of the sort of team, but obviously the everything is tracked by web platform tests. So you can see exactly how we're getting on by looking at the dashboard, and that's the nice thing about this process. And I think it's also one of the ways that we decide on which things to include is they need to have a full test suite. So sometimes things aren't included because the test suite isn't good enough for us to be able to actually tell if they're interoperable or not. So yeah, it's pretty, if the browsers are passing the tests, then the score goes up. So, to some degree, it's we can all look at that dashboard, but there are sort of regular meetings and things for the team because also the planning for the next year, the way it's been working is that actually begins partway through the year. We start thinking about, you know, what's the next year of Interop and which features will be included. So at this point it's an ongoing effort.
Great. So Alexander has another question. Will people always keep using pointers for buttons, even though the specs clearly outline that cursor pointer is only for links? Mm, I guess it's not so much a question. Maybe he's asking for your opinion on this.
I don't know. I guess yeah. Um, it's funny. It's like what are people's assumptions at this point? I don't know. And so, and I think So I'm not sure I have an opinion about that, but
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I'm not convinced that many people ever read a spec, and so
exactly.
typically we learn. I think most of us have learned web development by looking at other web development. So certainly it was how I learned, but there wasn't as much material around. But we're all learning off people, whether you're learning off someone on YouTube or you're learning off books or just from looking at people's stuff and sort of seeing how you can do that. So there's all sorts of things that become the way things are done that aren't specified anywhere or even specified differently, but that's just what people have decided to do. Um,
Yeah, I agree. In fact, you could argue in some ways this is how specs evolve because people choose to do things, and when it becomes an accepted standard, well, maybe we need to look back at the spec because we didn't consider this, or is it a valid use case or not? That these aren't necessarily like stuck in time type things. These are evolving things.
Yeah, and I think particularly anything sort of from earlier days of the web, things were far more loosely specified than they are now. So all sorts of things just kind of evolved.
Yes, I remember those days. So okay, Dan asks, he's excited to be joining from St. Helena. Can you comment on how you find governance of the CSS Working Group and how it helps or hinders your work and work of advancing the art and science of web development?
Yeah, so I mean, working groups. I think there's definitely you have to be a certain type to enjoy spending your time in working groups. That's, um, there's a lot of debate, but I think it's important, particularly for CSS. I think, anything we put into CSS is going to be there for a very long time. It's very hard for us to remove anything or to change anything. And so the fact that we have this process and that people, it's quite hard to push things through quickly. You have an idea, you write, a bit of a spec and say, I want to do this. This is how I think it's going to work. And it's very unlikely that that is what is going to go through the group and come out the other side and look exactly the same, whether it's a small thing or a big thing. Um, Someone's going to, bring up a problem. Someone is going to, look at the code of their browser and say, actually, I don't think that's really going to work for us. We're going to need to do this a different way. Someone's going to have some other research, or they know that people are doing a certain thing, and so that process, while it can seem quite painful, I think particularly from the outside, if you're looking and saying, why haven't we got this feature yet? Because there seems to be all this bike shedding going on. Generally, I think does come out with better solutions because we end up with the knowledge of everybody. And there are some amazingly knowledgeable people who have different takes on things. I was a web developer. I'm not a browser engineer. I'm a web developer and then someone who writes about web development. And so I have a take on things. How would I explain this to developers? Tends to be how I come at things. Would this make sense if I had to stand on stage and tell people about it? Because if not, then maybe it's not, the interface isn't great. The ergonomics aren't great. Somebody else is looking at browser code and saying, this is going to cause a performance problem if we do this way. And so I think having all of these takes ends up with something which typically is better than it would be if just us at Chrome sat down and said this is what we're going to do, or what one group or another. So yeah, I think it can be frustrating. You have to wait for your issue to come up in a meeting, and there's lots of issues, and there's a backlog, and then it gets debated, and you have to come back later with some changes. But I think generally that makes things better. And I have to say that I have learned so much by being involved in those processes. As someone who isn't a browser engineer, it's an incredible learning experience to be involved with the CSS Working Group.
Right. And I think those of us who were around in the days when, like, basically they couldn't get agreement on standards and things like that. I remember even the early days when, how long did it take to jump HTML versions? It was like a decade we took. There was a point when there was like a decade span between HTML versions, because we couldn't get agreement between the competitors, I think. And you'd had so many interoperability issues. I think
Mm.
you can appreciate like that this may be not the fastest process, but it's better than the alternative, right?
Yeah, and I think things were just not well specced. I mean, as I say, I did multi-column layout, and when that was one of the very first CSS3 specs. So one of the first things that kind of got split out when all the big sort of split up of specifications happened and it became modularized. And it really was just a set of examples. So it was kind of like saying, you should split this content into columns, but it didn't say how, or there wasn't really any specification text sort of clearly defining how that should happen and what should happen specifically around, say, items that spanned and things like that. And so I think we've got a lot more rigorous over the years, the working group of actually making sure that every little thing is specified, because it's the bits that aren't specified is where you get the differences, because it's left to each engineer to figure out how to do it. So typically now, engineers will come back and say, oh, well, I'm implementing this and I don't know what you expect me to do here. It's not in the spec. And so then the spec gets updated to actually include a decision for that thing. So yeah, so the sort of the more clear and specific that the specifications are, the better, because then we don't get these differences between browsers.
So Alex asks, and this is kind of related to what we've been talking about. I think just getting a slightly different angle at it. Since there are so many browsers on the market, is it hard to agree on future standards for all browsers and what areas get prioritized first? So I know you were talking about like how that debate goes on in the CSS spec process. Is it like Is it a lot of just discussion of how this gets implemented, or are there a lot of disagreements? I mean, what can you describe how that process works?
It's mostly just discussing. I mean, there are people with very strong opinions, but in general, the thing, and particularly in CSS is I can't really speak for the entire platform because I'm not involved in other areas of standards, but certainly in CSS, those people that are have these disagreements with, as it were, or people who are sort of interested in doing things a different way. Everybody really cares about the web. It's you don't come across people who are there for some nefarious purpose other than that they really care about the web and they want it to be good. We have different ideas sometimes about what good looks like. And, and obviously, and sometimes, we work for browsers that have different priorities. So sometimes we can't work on a thing we might actually personally want to work on or whatever. But, you know, it's a group of people who really, really care about the web and about getting it right, and about things not coming back and us thinking, oh yeah, we messed up there. We don't want to do that. and so that's the cool thing about this. And yeah, obviously there's a lot of debate and there's a lot of opinions. But generally people do care very much about the platform.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, personally, I appreciate the level of caution in this because, as you said, you can't. It's not like the kind of thing where you're like, oh, you implement a spec, and you're gonna be like, whoops, let's change it back. When all of a sudden it's like, being used in thousands of sites or
Yeah,
even millions of sites across the web. It's like, oh, I can't. Now we got to live with that mistake basically forever.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Zaid asks, this is completely changing topic here. Zaid asks, what tips do you have for becoming a DevRel or an evangelist it says in traditional enterprise environment, but like, I guess, do you have tips since you are working in developer relations? Do you have tips for
um
somebody who wants to go that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think building your profile. And actually, I mean, I was freelance until I started at Google just over 3 years ago. So I was kind of like an unofficial DevRel for bits of CSS that I cared about. So people know about me for talking about CSS Grid. Now I just took it upon myself to start going on about CSS Grid because I wanted the spec to sort of hang around. And I think that's you kind of most people who go into DevRel have got some kind of existing profile. They've got talks, they've got writing, or it didn't have to be all talks. There are plenty of DevRels who mainly write and mainly do other kinds of outreach. But I think it does help if there's stuff of yours out there that you can point to. And it doesn't need to be big conferences, or it can be meetups you've recorded or online things, doing video tutorials. There's a whole load of ways that people do that. But I think that's probably the main thing, is just making sure you've got a bit of a profile. And also practicing doing that, because if you're doing DevRel, you're going to have to go and talk to people about things, whether it's a big crowd or whether it's in small groups. So I think practicing that for the things that you care about, and figuring out what sort of stuff you want to be doing as a DevRel as well. Where what things are you good at? What do you enjoy doing? I don't particularly enjoy doing things like video tutorials and video shorts and things. It's just not really my thing. So, but
Me
there's people
neither.
who love that and are really good at it. So I think figuring out those things is probably the thing, and building at that profile.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I'd say I've been in it 15 years about being DevRel. Um, and one of the things I'd add, I think you're right. Find the things you're good at, because you can't do everything. Is definitely great advice. And I think also you have to recognize what the job is. I think some people think, oh, if I'm a DevRel, I'm just coding, like having fun coding cool stuff all day. And I try and warn people, like, it's actually probably, I'd say in my experience, about 30% coding at best. Um, it's not really like all day sitting there in front of your laptop building cool projects. A lot of it's speaking to people, having, meeting with customers, et cetera. Like it's, different
Mhm.
types of activities. Okay. So there's a bunch more questions, but I do want to actually switch topics a little bit here because I know you're involved with the baseline project, and I want to make sure people even know what the baseline project is about. So, like, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, we've both been web developers for a very long time. And I think that a common pain point through my entire career, like way back to like Netscape 4 days, is that, you don't know when things are going to actually be available for you to use. There's a cool feature that you see in one browser, then you realize it doesn't work in the other browser. And that's kind of got harder and harder as time's gone on. I think, when we had browsers that stuck around for a long time, so say IE 8 or something, we could kind of say, well, if it doesn't work in IE 8, I can't use it because, we had to wait for that browser to move on. But with evergreen browsers, Chrome and Firefox release every month. Safari is releasing quite regularly these days. It's actually very hard to know what's available for you to use. You hear about these cool features, then you discover that it actually isn't available in a browser. So Baseline was kind of an idea to try and solve this problem once and for all, to make it easy to know which features can I actually use kind of as a group rather than having to look individually at each feature. So the heart of the project is a data set, which is owned by a W3C community group. And it maps the entire web platform as a set of features and figures out whether they're ready to use. So does this feature, can you use it? There's no big interoperability gaps. Now, it's the first time we've had a large scale mapping like this. So although we've got things like Can I Use, which have done a bit of that, and MDN, where you can go and see individual properties and methods and so on. We've not really had something that's mapped everything. So if you go to MDN and also on web.dev, you'll see sort of indicators on pages about features saying this is part of baseline, which means roughly that it is, interoperable across our core browser set. And we have two lines. We have baseline newly available, which basically is interoperability. And then we have widely available, which is 30 months after that point, which is the point that you can probably pretty much safely use that without worrying about compatibility at that point.
So how this is basically if you go to web.dev or MDN, that's how you would find out if it's meets this baseline standard is checking the feature that you want to use. There's not like one of the things that can I use? I mean, it was like, oh, you just type it in and it would just bring up the chart is
Right.
slightly different, right?
Well, so now we've got the data set, and yeah, we are exposing it on these sites. We also have webstatus.dev, which is a dashboard where you can see which things are becoming baseline. But the real cool thing about having this data set is that we can then start to use the data. And we're already starting to see this happen. So there's a company called Run Vision, who are a real user data solution. They've incorporated baseline into their tools. So you can take your real user data, the people who are actually visiting your website, and you can find out which sort of line of baseline they support, or how many of your users wouldn't support things that are in baseline of that line. So you could take a group of all the features that are in baseline 2023, for example, which is everything that became available in 2023 and back, and you could see that, oh, well, actually only 7% of my users wouldn't get those features. So this is super useful. So we can now say, okay, I now know how much of the platform my users of my site support. And then and hopefully, now we've got this data, the next sort of hope is that we can roll that out across the tool chain. So your IDE should tell you, if you've said, I'm going to use baseline 2023, as you're developing, if you try and use a feature that doesn't fit, it should let you know that. We should get, things like, linters and things that you run as part of your CI pipeline, being able to say, hey, you've used a feature which maybe doesn't have great browser support for you. So I think that's really the exciting part of this now. I mean, yes, we can use it for showing status, and that's a really good use case if you're writing about a feature. We've got like a little widget you can put on your site if you're writing about a feature. But I think the really exciting stuff is now we've got this grouping and it's getting updated as new features come out. We can then start to roll that into tooling. And that's kind of the next phase of this, actually making it so you can develop for the web without kind of constantly checking MDN or what have you for support.
I mean, I recall that like even back in the day, Can I Use did have a data set, but it was basically the dogs are going crazy here, of course. Um, it was just a big file, a GitHub repo, right? So this you could actually build something more interactive, maybe even extension for
I
your
mean,
IDE or things like that. Right?
right. Yeah, I mean it does. It is actually backed by a big GitHub repo, which you can go and have a look at. But then that is then backed. Behind that are the keys that map to the browser compat data, which shows on MDN. So like that's our best kind of representation of the platform in terms of individual features, like right down to a CSS property or a JavaScript method. And what we've done with this feature grouping work is bring those things together to say, well, actually, all of these different bits make one feature. It's not a whole thing unless it's got all these different bits. And that hasn't existed really before, because, an entire spec isn't a feature. There's lots of stuff in CSS that's just never been implemented and nobody even knows about, but it's part of specific specifications. So it's been quite a process to figure that out. But now we have. I think there's all sorts of exciting things that could come from that. And I do feel it's the sort of best chance we have of somehow solving this problem. And it's also highlighting things like, how much faster things are becoming interoperable now. You mentioned waiting ages between HTML versions. I mean, there was 10 years between versions of Internet Explorer at one point, after IE6. We waited and like the platform just stopped. But even in the last, sort of 4 or 5 years, we're seeing, really big features become available across browsers pretty quickly, within a few months. And I think this data helps to highlight that sort of thing as well. The actual improvements to the platform, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that is super useful. I mean, and as somebody who went through those days when things move slowly, I mean, sites like Can I Use were helpful, but they were updated only had to be really updated periodically, and now it's like things are moving much faster.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I want to get back to the audience questions a little bit here. So Charles asked, what's a CSS spec or proposal you believe to be underrated that isn't getting the attention it deserves?
Um, I mean, you see, I would say multi-column layout because I think people just don't think about it, and part of that is because of a very specific problem with it. In that, if you have too much content for your columns, you either end up scrolling up and down, which is terrible, or you set a height on it and they go off in the inline direction. We are intending to fix that. I've got a level 2 of the spec. In fact, this morning I was writing some spec text for that. I think, but multi-col is quite an interest. It's the only thing we have that behaves like that will just let you split a bunch of text up into columns. But I think the thing that I really get excited about and nobody ever talks about really is CSS for print. There's a whole bunch of specifications which are for printed material, as in printing books and things, which browsers don't implement, although they have started implementing some of those features. But there are other user agents that aren't browsers, which are designed just for doing print with CSS. It's pretty fun to design a book using CSS and then actually print it and be able to do all the layout and things. And I think that's definitely something that people don't often realize exists and is a very cool part of the platform.
Yeah, I've seen some of those tools for people like not even self-publishing, but even some publishers. When I wrote for some publishers in the past, they actually used
Mm.
CSS and HTML to do the layout. So yeah, absolutely something that exists. Henri asks, can we expect anchor positioning to reach baseline soonish, or just by the end of the year?
Yep, it's in Interop, so that means that the hope is that it should become interoperable and therefore baseline newly available this year. That's the hope, and I think that's a pretty exciting one.
So what's like, is there a relationship between Interop like directly in the baseline project, or is it just kind of like indirectly they would go through Interop and then that feature will likely become part of baseline.
Yeah, I mean, if all those tests are passing, then yes, that is probably going to mean that that feature is in baseline. So a lot of the things that became baseline in 2024 were part of Interop. So yeah, it's probably our best read on what is coming to baseline is the things that are in Interop. Um, it kind of gives us a bit of a heads up as to what's likely to land.
So, changing topics here again, Alexander asks, what makes a good technical writer and how do you enhance your tech writing skills?
Um, I think a curiosity. I think, you can learn how to write. Actually, Google has publicly available tech writing courses, which I think are very good and often people recommend them. But I think, in terms of technical writing, a lot of it's about being quite curious and about being able to ask questions. Because, you'll often have to write about something that you don't really know about. You have to find that out, and you have to find that out probably from an engineer who's worked on it. So kind of being able to ask questions and not being afraid of doing that is pretty important. Also, having, good writing skills, knowing how to follow a style guide is incredibly useful. A lot of people don't get a lot of practice at that, and that's everyone has got different style guides they want to comply with. So it's useful getting used to kind of to write and edit to a style guide. Editing other people's stuff and having your stuff edited. Um, I think, I spot a lot of writing problems when I'm editing someone else's stuff. And then I realize that I also do them myself. um, and then, but, and having your stuff edited, I learned so much from my team, that, a lot of them are better copy editors than I am, for example, and will pick up on issues. And obviously I'm a Brit and we write in American English. So there are things that I miss, and so I think actually having your stuff edited by someone else is incredibly helpful if you can get into that position. If you write maybe for a publication and they will do an edit, work with that editor and see what they're changing, because you learn a lot by having someone redline all over your stuff. Um, but yeah, I think as I say, it's part writing and part just learning how to write and part having this kind of curiosity at how things work and how to explain them.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there, and I think, one of the things is even the best writers, in my experience, like can benefit from editing, like just and
Yeah.
not learning not to take those edits personally really is a big deal,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. And I think, and it's hard because you write something and you think, yeah, I'm really, you're really pleased with it. And then someone comes along and like messes around with it and you're like, oh, you know. And I think the more that happens to you, the more used to it you get. And yeah,
Yeah.
so, but it's something that I think is useful for everyone to learn how to do because writing is just so important. It might just be an email while you're explaining a feature that you've been working on. But that's writing, that's technical writing. So it's a useful thing to build.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and it's not necessarily something I recommend, but like writing a book was the one where I had to really get over myself in terms of because the editing process and that was so often so difficult that I'm like, okay, you had to decide what things were worth fighting about to keep in terms of
Yes.
your own writing style versus what things, okay, you know what, I can learn from that. And I did learn a lot of things from that.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, like not making a lot of assumptions about what people's technical knowledge is who are reading this, and and where best to adding explanation before I show code and things like that. So um, lots of difficult lessons I learned over the years. So
Yeah. Yes, it's definitely a humbling experience to be edited and but always valuable. So
absolutely. So okay, this question may feel free to defer if you rather not answer. So, but I'm asking the audience question here. It was upvoted as well. So, is Apple holding things up? Sometimes it seems like Safari is basically the laggard.
I mean, I not going to reply with a personal opinion, but I think that depends on what you care about on the platform. When I'm talking to developers about any features, on the platform, people have got different things that they're really stuck on. They're like, why isn't this thing available across browser? Why isn't that thing available? And it can be quite, it can be a feature from any browser. I've had people come to me, as someone who works at Chrome, asking why we haven't done a certain thing or why we're holding something up. So I think the perception tends to be around very specific features that people are keen to have, because there's obviously a lot of work that Apple have done, which, they have been the people pushing that forward, particularly in CSS. And there are other things that either they haven't done or they said they don't want to do. As I say, browsers often have standard positions against things that they're not intending to do. From writing about this stuff, it's actually quite even who is last to ship something. Because, I write sort of a news to the web platform blog post where I just, talk about the things that are landing in different browsers. And, sometimes it's us who is the person who has held it up, and sometimes it's somebody else. So it's probably more even than you think. I've not done any data on this, but I think, yeah, there's definitely frustrations with things because of specific features that people want. We do hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, that each company has their own sets of priorities. Um,
Right.
so yeah, it's it's going to be different for depending on which you're talking about. I think a lot of times in from my experience where Apple's more like the laggard sometimes on JavaScript stuff than they are on CSS stuff, but
Yeah.
I can't,
I think it does go back to how these things are standardized. With CSS, we tend to very much work together because you can't really ship a CSS feature if other people don't want it, because no one's going to use it. I think with some of the JavaScript APIs, depending on the sort of thing it is, sometimes people are like, well, actually, we can use this. And so I think that they're sort of standardized in different ways, and so that tends not to happen so much like in my world, in the CSS world, because we've already debated these things to the nth degree before they get into a browser, most of the time.
makes total sense. Okay, let's see. We've got time for, I think, for one more question. So we've got a lot of questions. So I apologize to the audience that we are not going to get to all these questions, but I'm going to let's see. I'm going to see if we can pick one last one here. Another one from Alexander. Um, what type of content do you find the most important for learning? Blog posts, podcasts, video, etc.
For me, it tends to be written stuff. I have aphantasia, so I have no visual memory. So if I watch something, I will never remember what it was that I just saw. Although I do find videos sometimes useful to like learn my way around an interface. I'm very bad at learning any interfaces because I can't remember what it looked like last time I looked at it. But I'm very, very text based. I tend to think of things in sort of reams of text. That's how I sort of perceive everything. So that's me personally. I've kind of learned to do things in a more visual way, and I understand that video is very important for people because I've seen that. I've seen how important that is for other people, and I think that's the thing is, the more you can provide your content in different ways, the better. If you can provide stuff as text and video, if you can get out and talk to people, because there are, people who are all over, sort of in terms of how they best learn. And so if you've got some content, you can do it in 2 or 3 ways, then brilliant, because you're going to reach more people with that content.
Absolutely agree with you. I mean, yeah, I am focused on writing as well. That's where how I prefer to learn, but I think I am aware that lots of other people have different learning styles, and
Mm.
like the more you can provide, especially if you're trying to reach a broad audience, like if you can repurpose content for video and for written, even if it's or audio, even if that's possible, then go for it, right? I don't think there's a better. It's what works for you.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. But yeah, definitely reuse your stuff in lots of different ways, and you'll definitely reach more of an audience that way. So
Yeah, totally agree. So, Well, we are unfortunately out of time, even though there's a long list of questions we still had to get to. But before we go, just where can people kind of find you on the web, and maybe connect with you, like on social or anything, after this?
Yeah, so I'm on Blue Sky, is probably my main place. So I'm Rachel Andrew. You can find me on Blue Sky fairly easily. And my personal blog is rachelandrew.co.uk. But yeah, I'm Rachel Andrew in most sort of online places. So you can fairly easy to search.
Excellent. So yeah, maybe they'll reach out to you on on Blue Sky and be like asking their questions there. But
Yeah, I'm very happy to answer some questions.
great. Well, this was such a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to come out and chat with us. I learned a lot. Hopefully, people in the audience did as well.
Yeah, it's been great fun. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the event. Thank you.